in the African church that I am familiar with. We would rather not talk about certain issues, no matter how glaring they become. Think about issues such as same-sex marriage, homosexuality, the sacramental roles, ministerial roles for women in the church, married clergy, etc. Many of my colleagues with whom I'm in contact would rather dismiss these as issues for the church in Africa. We rarely talk about them unless, of course, to condemn them outright or to defend the official line in regard to these contentious ethical issues. I want to look at issues within our church on the continent. And in the context of events and circumstances that shape the identity, function, the mission of this church. I use the notion of taboo within the cultural reality of Africa to illustrate the fact that in surveying the ethical landscape on the continent, whether in church or in society, the space for a credible, critical, and public moral discourse appears severely constricted. This situation stems from the tendency to impose prohibitions on the debate of some moral issues that are considered, in quotes, Western, and therefore, in quotes, un-African. Very often, I notice that culture colludes with dominant orthodoxies in Christian ethics to form a very formidable alliance that denies the existence of a set of moral issues even in the face of multiple manifestations. The danger here that I see is for African ethicists and theologians to consider Christian ethics and theology as simply an extension of culture, modified only in part by its biblical input. Furthermore, the denial of certain moral issues is rarely substantiated by force of critical, ethical, and theological analysis. On the contrary, the norm prioritizes stifling the debate. So in this context, the theologians that I am in contact with, some of them at least, are rarely free to conduct an open debate on issues that carry the pejorative label, quotes, Western. Unless the aim, of course, is to deny them, condemn them, or repeat, as I said earlier on, the official line. My point is not to suggest that the controversies surrounding some of these ethical issues are peculiar to Africa, but that in many parts of the continent, the approaches to these issues are largely constrained by a culture of taboo and denial. As I mentioned, interestingly, on some of these ethical taboos, church and state in Africa find common ground in their attempt to preserve what is considered pristine African religious values and cultural heritage, while at the same time imposing sanctions and limits on open debate on contentious moral issues. One example is the case of two gay Malawian men highly publicized a few weeks ago, who were recently sentenced to 14 years in jail for publicly conducting an engagement ceremony. Both of them drew the contempt and condemnation of church and state. Both church and state based their opposition on the prescriptions of African culture and the scripture. Now, yet, when the state proposes to integrate elements of reproductive health into the Constitution, such as is the case presently in Kenya, the church parts ways with the state. This attitude, I believe, is suggestive of a certain lack of consistency and coherence in our approach as church to ethics and public morality. My principal aim during today's presentation is to pose questions, or rather share with you some questions that I have rather than provide answers. I would like at the beginning still to mention a disclaimer that Jim had already mentioned, that I am a Jesuit, I'm an ordained priest in the Roman Catholic Church. I cherish my vocation to the priesthood as a fulfilling ministry that allows me to integrate my faith and my life in the world today. By trade, as Jim mentioned, I am also a theologian, even though my present job doesn't allow me sufficient time to practice. And actually, I consider it a treat to be able to have a conversation around issues of faith, theology, and church, such as we are having today. I would also like to add that my own theological formation is developed in the context of critical scholarship and creative fidelity to the traditions and teachings of our Christian community. And so in presenting some of these ideas and asking some of these questions, my sole purpose is to invite and stimulate conversation around issues, some of them contentious. Today, the issues I want to talk about relate primarily to the understanding and practice of ordained ministry in the church in Africa. Why bother? Well, they matter to me. I take my vocation to the priesthood very seriously. I would like to understand and continue to understand it in light of contemporary developments. And here it's a case of faith seeking understanding. Besides, we've just concluded the year for the priests, proclaimed by Pope Benedict XVI. And what a year it has been for priests all over the world. So in the overall context of ministry, I would like to talk about some aspects of priesthood that we're not accustomed to talking about publicly in the church in Africa. My principal thesis and position on this matter is that certain trends in the church in Africa and in the world at large will affect, challenge, change, and, I believe more importantly, strengthen the institution and practice of ordained ministry in Africa. As the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez once argued, and I quote, "Social tensions have effects within the church itself." If the church is really present in the world, it cannot but reflect in its own life the events disturbing the world, end of quote. So what I talk about today are not based on any privileged revelation